For decades, fans have admired the bond between Kevin Costner and Robert Redford, two Hollywood giants whose names defined an entire era of filmmaking. Their connection seemed effortless, built on mutual respect, creative admiration, and a shared understanding of what it meant to tell powerful stories. But now at 70, Kevin Costner has finally broken his silence, revealing the truth about their relationship. And it's far more emotional, complicated, and surprising than anyone ever imagined. Costner's confession isn't about scandal, it's about honesty, legacy, and the weight of expectations that follow two legends who helped shape Hollywood. The world remembers Redford as the visionary who gave Costner one of the most significant opportunities of his career. The two were forever linked through their groundbreaking film collaborations and the gentle mentorship that seemed visible in every interview and shared moment. But behind the scenes, there were conversations, decisions, and emotional crossroads that Costner never addressed publicly. Until now. What he reveals changes how we view their friendship, their careers, and the sacrifices that come with life in the spotlight. Costner's words are not bitter. They're reflective, filled with gratitude, regret, and a kind of truth that only surfaces when a man reaches a point in life where he can finally look back without fear of judgment. He speaks about loyalty, creative battles, personal misunderstandings, and the unspoken tension that shaped their time together. And yet, he also shares something deeply heartfelt, a side of Robert Redford that Hollywood rarely saw, and a memory that still affects him today. For the first time, Kevin Costner is revealing the truth, and what he says will leave fans stunned, emotional, and seeing both men in a completely new light. Kevin Costner's connection to Robert Redford began long before the two ever met in person. As a young actor trying to find his place in Hollywood, Costner admired Redford not just for his striking screen presence, but for his ability to bring truth, warmth, and purpose into every role. Redford was more than a movie star. He was a symbol of thoughtful storytelling, a man who valued depth over fame, craft over glamour. So when Costner first heard whispers that Redford was interested in directing him, it felt like a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Their paths officially crossed during the early development of a film that would eventually redefine Costner's career. Redford didn't want a typical audition. He wanted a conversation. He wanted to see who Costner was, not who he could pretend to be. Costner later admitted that he walked into that meeting terrified, convinced he needed to impress the legendary filmmaker. But to his surprise, Redford wasn't looking for a polished performance. He wanted honesty. He asked about Costner's childhood, his dreams, his failures, and his doubts. For the first time, Costner felt seen not as a struggling actor, but as a storyteller in his own right. That meeting planted the seeds of a partnership built on mutual respect. Redford believed in Costner even when studios hesitated. He saw beyond the surface, recognizing a determination and sincerity that reminded him of his own early years. For Costner, that belief changed everything. It wasn't just a professional boost. It was validation from a man whose work he'd studied and admired for years. When they finally collaborated, the chemistry between them was undeniable. Redford approached directing with calm precision, never raising his voice, never demanding attention. Costner watched him closely, amazed at how effortlessly he navigated chaos with grace. Redford didn't instruct, he guided. He didn't control, he inspired. And for a young actor seeking direction, that kind of leadership was life-changing. Their early conversations often drifted beyond the script. They talked about the cost of fame, the pressure of staying relevant, and the emotional toll that comes with choosing art over personal life. Redford shared candid stories about his own struggles, things he rarely spoke about publicly. Costner absorbed every word, realizing that behind the composed exterior was a man who had faced heartbreak, loss, and overwhelming expectations. To the outside world, it looked like a perfect mentorship, but privately, Costner wrestled with self-doubt. Working with Redford meant holding himself to impossible standards. Every line, every gesture, every emotional beat felt heavier, as if he were performing not just for audiences, but for the approval of the man he admired most. Yet Redford never pressured him. Instead, he quietly pushed Costner to trust his instincts, to dig deeper, to find truth even in the smallest moments. In many ways, their relationship began not with fame, but with vulnerability. Two men from different generations connecting through their shared love of storytelling. Costner has often described those early days as some of the most formative of his career. It was during this period that he realized Robert Redford wasn't simply a mentor. He was someone who shaped the way Costner approached the craft for the rest of his life. This chapter of their partnership was defined by discovery, of trust, admiration, and the beginnings of a connection that would leave an indelible mark on both men. But as Costner would later reveal, their journey wasn't always smooth. Behind the praise and the public smiles, there were moments of misunderstanding, emotional tension, and decisions that haunted him for years. As Kevin Costner and Robert Redford continued to work together, their bond grew stronger, yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions began to form. These weren't the loud, dramatic disagreements Hollywood often imagines, but quiet moments of misunderstanding that neither man fully addressed at the time. Their admiration for one another was real, but with two passionate storytellers, creative friction was inevitable. And as Costner now admits, these unspoken tensions shaped their relationship more deeply than he ever expected. It began during a period when Costner's career was rising at a speed even he hadn't anticipated. He was suddenly everywhere, leading major films, earning critical praise, and becoming one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. Redford, already an icon for decades, had spent years navigating the pressures of fame. He understood the emotional weight that comes with sudden success. Costner, however, was still learning. Redford tried to guide him gently, offering advice in his typically soft-spoken manner. But Costner was in a whirlwind, pulled between new opportunities, public expectations, and the desire to prove himself worthy of the trust Redford had placed in him. As he now reflects, there were times when he misinterpreted Redford's guidance as doubt, when in reality, it came from genuine concern. One of the most defining moments occurred during a critical scene they were filming together. Costner delivered his performance with full intensity, believing he had captured the emotional heart of the moment. Redford, reviewing the take, suggested a subtle shift. Less force, more vulnerability. It wasn't criticism, it was refinement. But Costner, under immense pressure, took the note personally. He felt he had disappointed a man he idolized. Redford noticed the discomfort, but didn't push further. He respected Costner too much to force a conversation he wasn't ready to have. But that silence created a quiet emotional distance. Costner now admits that he carried that misunderstanding for far longer than he should have, believing he had fallen short of Redford's expectations. Their busy schedules only added to the strain. After their collaboration, the two were pulled in different directions. Movies, press tours, commitments, family responsibilities. They spoke occasionally, always with warmth, always with respect, but neither addressed the lingering tension from those early creative disagreements. Costner later revealed that he feared bringing it up. He didn't want Redford to think he was ungrateful or overly sensitive. Yet the truth is that Redford saw far more in Costner than Costner realized. He admired his drive, his sincerity, and his willingness to take risks. Behind closed doors, Redford praised Costner's determination, calling him one of the few actors willing to carry the emotional weight of a story from the inside out. But Redford, famously private, rarely expressed these sentiments directly. That lack of verbal affirmation left room for misinterpretation, and Costner filled that silence with his own insecurities. Years later, when he finally looked back with clarity, he understood that the tension had never been rooted in conflict. It was rooted in his desire to make Redford proud. This unspoken emotional conflict left a mark. Costner regrets not opening up sooner, not sharing his fears, not telling Redford how much that guidance meant, even when he struggled to hear it. But as he now admits, the lessons he learned from those moments stayed with him for the rest of his career. In the end, the tension between them wasn't a clash. It was the growing pains of two artists trying to honor each other's strengths while navigating the pressures of their industry. And though it created emotional distance, it also laid the foundation for one of the most meaningful revelations Costner shares today. Truths about Redford's kindness, loyalty, and the moment that changed how he viewed him forever. There are moments in life that stay with a person forever, moments that shift perspective, reveal someone's true character, or resolve years of quiet uncertainty. For Kevin Costner, one such moment came unexpectedly, years after he and Robert Redford had worked side by side. It was a moment so honest, so vulnerable, that it redefined how he viewed Redford. Not just as a mentor or colleague, but as a deeply compassionate human being whose influence reached far beyond the screen. Costner recalls that the moment came during a private conversation, away from cameras, away from Hollywood pressure, and away from the noise of fame. Their careers had taken them down different paths, and though they had remained connected, they hadn't fully addressed the emotional distance that formed after their early creative misunderstandings. Costner admits now that he carried a quiet fear with him for years. The fear that he had disappointed Redford back then, that he hadn't lived up to the potential Redford saw in him. But on that day, Redford said something that changed everything. In a calm, reflective voice, he told Costner that he had always admired his courage. Not the kind seen on screen, the dramatic heroism that audiences cheer for, but the quieter courage of choosing roles with heart, of taking risks when it mattered, of prioritizing authenticity over popularity. Redford told him that few actors were willing to shoulder emotional responsibility for a story, but Costner was one of them. Those words hit harder than any award or review ever could. Costner later admitted that no piece of praise had ever affected him the same way. In that moment, years of doubt, tension, and emotional hesitation melted away. Redford had seen him, truly seen him from the very beginning, and what Costner had once interpreted as criticism or disappointment was actually a form of mentorship deeper than he realized. But the moment didn't end there. Redford shared something personal, something Costner had never known. He spoke briefly about a period of his life filled with grief and emotional struggle, details he never revealed publicly. By sharing that vulnerability, Redford allowed Costner to understand him in a new way. It wasn't just about filmmaking, it was about life, resilience, and the quiet battles even icons must face. Costner walked away from that conversation with a renewed appreciation for the man who had shaped so much of his artistic identity. That moment also brought clarity to the misunderstood tension between them. Costner discovered that Redford had never doubted him, not once. In fact, Redford had defended him in rooms Costner never entered, praised him when it mattered most, and encouraged studios to trust his vision. Costner had spent years worrying that he had fallen short, when in reality, Redford had been one of his strongest supporters behind the scenes. This realization became a turning point. It strengthened their bond, healed old uncertainties, and allowed Costner to embrace his own legacy without fear. He later said that the conversation taught him a profound truth. Sometimes, the people we admire most show their support quietly, in ways we don't fully recognize until much later. From that day on, Costner viewed Redford not just as a mentor, but as a quiet guardian of his career, a man whose belief in him never wavered, even when Costner doubted himself. And today, as he reflects at age 70, that moment remains one of the most defining and emotional experiences of his journey. Now, at 70, Kevin Costner is finally speaking openly about the truth he carried for decades, truth about admiration, misunderstandings, regret, and the profound respect he still holds for Robert Redford. Age brings clarity, and for Costner, this clarity has unlocked an honesty he never felt ready to share until now. What he reveals is emotional, heartfelt, and surprisingly vulnerable, shedding new light on one of Hollywood's most fascinating creative relationships. Costner begins by admitting that for many years, he lived with an invisible weight, an unspoken fear that he had never fully expressed how much Redford meant to him. While their early collaborations were filled with mutual respect, Costner now recognizes how much he allowed his own insecurities to shape the narrative in his mind. At the time, he was a rising star who wanted to prove himself worthy of the trust Redford placed in him. Every critique felt heavier, every suggestion carried more emotional weight than Redford ever intended. Looking back, Costner realizes that Redford wasn't evaluating him as a superior, looking down on a newcomer. Instead, he was guiding him as an equal, someone he believed had the capacity to carry stories with emotional truth. Redford saw the potential before Costner saw it in himself, and that belief shaped the direction of his entire career. Costner also speaks candidly about their creative differences. He admits that sometimes he misread Redford's calm demeanor as distance, when in reality it was Redford's way of respecting space and allowing actors to find their emotional footing on their own terms. Redford wasn't withholding, he was simply allowing room for discovery. Now Costner sees that this quiet style was part of what made Redford a remarkable mentor, not just for him, but for countless storytellers who crossed his path. One of the most emotional truths Costner reveals is that he regrets not telling Redford sooner how deeply that mentorship shaped him. He regrets letting pride and fear prevent honest conversations. But rather than dwell on remorse, Costner speaks with gratitude. He acknowledges that Redford gave him something far more valuable than public praise. He gave him confidence, direction, in the reminder that storytelling should always come from a place of sincerity. Costner also admits a truth few expected. He once considered walking away from Hollywood entirely. At a time when success felt overwhelming and public attention felt suffocating, he thought about stepping back for good. The pressure, the expectations, and the emotional strain had taken a toll. But during that difficult period, it was Redford's advice, simple, quiet, and deeply thoughtful, that helped him stay grounded. Redford told him that the world always needs storytellers who care. It was a message Costner held onto during some of the darkest moments of his career. Now, with decades of experience behind him, Costner feels a sense of peace when he reflects on Redford. The misunderstandings no longer overshadow the truth. The regrets no longer silence the gratitude. Costner describes their connection as one built not on spectacle or headlines, but on respect. Genuine, enduring, and quietly powerful. He also acknowledges something few expected him to say, that Redford influenced him not just as an actor, but as a man. Watching how Redford navigated the pressures of fame while protecting his values taught Costner lessons he still carries today. It taught him to choose projects with purpose, to lead with integrity, and to approach storytelling with heart rather than ambition. And so, at 70, Kevin Costner shares the truth he once struggled to express. Robert Redford wasn't just a mentor. He was a model of the kind of artist and the kind of person Costner aspired to become. Their relationship may have been shaped by unspoken emotions and creative friction, but at its core, it was built on admiration, gratitude, and a legacy that will endure long after their careers fade from the spotlight. The connection between Kevin Costner and Robert Redford remained one of Hollywood's most quietly compelling relationships. Two men whose careers circled each other, whose instincts aligned, and whose journeys often mirrored one another. But as Costner reflects today, he admits that their bond was not built on ease or simplicity. Instead, it was shaped by unspoken competition, profound respect, and a shared understanding of what it means to carry the weight of an entire industry on their shoulders. Costner reveals that one of the most defining moments between them came not during a film project, but during a private conversation that took place long before he was famous. He recalls Redford giving him a short, almost cryptic piece of advice that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Never chase the light, make them turn it toward you. Costner now says those words changed the entire course of his career. He understood that Redford wasn't talking about lighting on set. He meant presence, influence, and authenticity. Redford believed that if a performer was true to the craft, the industry would eventually shift in their direction. And for Costner, that prophecy came true. Yet what Costner shares now is that their dynamic wasn't always comfortable. As Costner rose rapidly with films like Field of Dreams, Bull Durham, and Dances with Wolves, he became the new leading man Hollywood counted on. Many people compared him to Redford, calling him the next generation Redford. Costner admits that those comparisons created invisible tension. Not because Redford resented him, but because Costner felt unworthy of being placed side by side with someone he considered untouchable. He remembers one industry event where a journalist introduced him by saying, "Hollywood has finally found its new Robert Redford." Costner says Redford's expression in that moment was unreadable. Not angry, not jealous, but almost sad. Costner believes Redford never wanted to be replaced, even symbolically, and Costner never wanted to be that person. What Costner only now reveals is how much he avoided discussing the comparisons publicly out of respect. He says he deliberately turned down certain roles that felt Redford-like because he wanted to forge his own identity. He believed the industry already had one Redford, and it was wrong to step into a shadow that didn't belong to him. Despite everything, the two men shared a deep, almost instinctive appreciation for each other's craft. Costner says they communicated more through silence than words. A nod, a glance, a private smile that acknowledged mutual understanding. Hollywood, Costner explains, is a place where people constantly pretend. But Redford was someone who didn't have to try. That honesty intimidated Costner at first, but eventually it became the foundation of their bond.